Today's message is entitled Counteracting the Culture. Counteracting the Culture. You know, we all live in a culture, a society. When we think of culture, maybe you have different ideas of what that means, but it really means the society that we live in, the practices that they have, the people that are in it, of course, and the values and the ideals that they hold. Culture, there's two things that are true about the culture that we live in and that anybody lives in. Number one, culture is constantly changing. And number two, culture is constantly changing us. And I don't know whether we recognize this from time to time. Sometimes we need to think about this, think, oh no, I don't get changed by culture. Well, the truth is, you do. Do you know that every year there's a big company called Pantone. They make colors. Basically, they invent colors, is the way of looking at it. Every year they come out with the color of the year. And this every year it's a new color that they're going to promote. Do you know why you like the colors you like? It's because you've been influenced by culture. You say, oh, that's not true. I've always liked certain colors. Well, I don't see many people putting in those burnt orange countertops anymore. Or those avocado appliances aren't being sold at Walmart like they used to, right? There's a reason colors change, because we have been influenced by what we like in terms of color. It's true about music that we listen to. Why is it that you listen or like certain kinds of music? Well, it's because culture has fed that to you, and you've liked it. I don't know too many people that go around today and whistle down by the Old Mill Stream. That was a popular song in 1901. Why don't we sing that anymore? Well, it's because that's not part of our culture today, right? It's true in terms of all kinds of things that are influencing us and affecting us. What we like and what we don't like, what we do and what we don't do, how we spend our time, and what we value and what our ideals are. Whether we like it or not, we are constantly under pressure to submit to the ideals and the values of culture around us. It's constantly trying to impose its own value system onto us. And of course, as believers who are to take our values and ideals from the Word of God, this can be a very dangerous thing. And, if we look at this passage today, we're going to see not the influence that culture is to have on us, but rather what influence we are to have on the culture around us. And we see some amazing things that come out of this passage this morning as we look at this message. We, of course, are here in Ephesus. It says, verse 23, at the same time there arose no small stir about that way. That way meaning this is the way of the Christians. The manner of life that the Christians, as they came to know Christ, as the churches were established, as these, as this idea of coming to Christ and changing who you are, as that spread like wildfire, as more and more people came to Christ, all of a sudden, culture took notice. And I think that the first thing we see here is immediately the problem that's identified is that some of the spending habits of the Christians had affected the silversmiths in town. It says a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation, and said, Sirs, you know that by this craft we have our wealth. Somehow, in the course of all of these believers coming to Christ in the city of Ephesus, those that were selling things to the pagan shrines, selling trinkets and selling souvenirs, if you will, they recognized that there was some real problems that are on the border. They were worried about how the economy was going to change because of people's lives that were changed by Christ. And this is our first point this morning. Living for Christ changes our spending habits. When we want to say we're really living for Christ, it should change how we spend our money. You know, that created this stir in the beginning, verse 23. You know, back in 1992, and I hate talk about politics, but there's a truth to this. Back in 1992, Bill Clinton was up for election, trying to beat incumbent George Bush, the first George Bush. Some of you remember this. And he was an unknown. He didn't seem to know, like the ropes like a lot of them did. But he was known as the comeback kid. He kept making his way through the primaries and then eventually defeated him in the general election. One of his strategists was a fellow by the name of James Carville. And he's still around today, I think. But nonetheless, he coined this term during Bill Clinton's election. It's the economy, stupid. And this was Bill Clinton's motto all through his campaign. It's the economy, stupid. Keep pounding on the fact that it's the people are going to vote based on their pocketbooks. People are going to just choose who to have as their leader based on their economic situation. And if that's bad, you can capitalize on that and get people's votes because of it. And you know what? It's true not just in politics. It's true in everything. You know, if you ever see you ever see corruption in government, you see corruption in business, what do they always say? Follow the money, right? Follow the money. Because where the money is spent is going to lead you to the truth. And it's going to lead you to people's values. It's going to help you understand. And you know what? The same should be true for us as believers. Living for Christ should be changing our spending habits. And this is the point. This is where Paul's at this morning. The world takes notice of changes that affect their economy. The world will take notice of things that will affect them. You know, the culture takes notice of things that the believers were doing that were affecting them. They could go around and preach the gospel all they wanted, and that got them upset, especially got the Jews upset. But all of a sudden, they weren't buying all of these pagan souvenirs, these pagan silver trinkets that they were selling for the temple of Diana. And all of a sudden, the economy and the way that was working in the city of Ephesus, this was causing a problem. All of a sudden, it wasn't just about, some religion and some people want to believe this or they want to believe that. No, they're not spending their money like they used to. This was a real problem. They were changing their spending habits. They were no longer spending their money in the same way they were used to. And they were likely giving more money to the church, most likely. But it was more than just that. It wasn't just that, I've now got this tithe that I'm not spending. No, it was they were changing the places they were going. They weren't going to the temple anymore. They weren't supporting the types of enterprises that were going on in the city. And as they grew and matured in their faith, all of a sudden, the money wasn't flowing in the same direction that it used to flow because the Christians were having an impact. At the end of verse 25, we just saw this. He gathers together this Demetrius, the silversmith. He gathers together all the other people who are in the same occupation as him, and he said, "Sirs, you know that by this craft we have our wealth." You say, we don't really understand what these guys were doing today, and we don't have really a counterpart for this because the whole economy in Ephesus, you have to understand, was revolved around this temple, this worship of Diana. Diana was a Roman goddess, and if you actually look in the Greek here, it's the temple of Artemis, which is the name of the Greek goddess. The Greeks and the Romans had goddesses who were counterparts of each other. And so whether it's Diana or Artemis, this was a goddess of hunting and fertility. At this point in time, if you go to Ephesus today, you'll only find just the foundations and some fragments that remain of this site. There's almost nothing left of it. But at this time in history, the temple of Ephesus, the temple of Artemis, the temple of Diana, this was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This was a major tourist attraction. Some form of the temple had been there in Ephesus for well over 700 years by the time the first century rolled around. When this was being written, this thing was ancient, and it was large. It was well developed. It was a major center. And there was a lot of income that came to the residents of Ephesus around this tourism industry. You know, it was a religion. There was religious there. It was a place for that. And it was also a place of just, hey, I've got to come see this. You know, it's like today. You might say, well, if I go to India, if I ever travel to India, one place I would like to see is the Taj Mahal. You know, I've never seen pictures of it. But, you know, it's this magnificent palace. Now, do I have any interest in the religion of those people over there? No, none whatsoever. But there's a magnificent building and a magnificent site. I'd be interested in seeing that. And this was the case here. Whether the people were all worshiping Diana wasn't the point. The point was there's a whole tourism industry just to come and see the temple and be a part. Think about this. Even today, tourism generates revenue, right? You have people that are in the service industries. You have people that are renting out housing, people that are in food service. You have to have restaurants. And you have this whole industry like the Demetrius was running, where they were selling the little shrines. They sold little silver shrines of Diana. You right? These were not only religious artifacts, they were, hey, you could take this home. You know, think about like you go to some place, they have a keychain. You know, hey, I visited here and I made it back, or I got a bumper sticker to put in my car, or whatever it is. These were things that they could take with them and buy. These were major sources of income. And many people in the city would have made their living from the tourists who would travel there and needed this food and lodging and tours and things like that. All of a sudden, things were changing because the revenue had dropped off. Because believers, Christians, they no longer came to see Diana. They no longer bought a souvenir. They no longer, the ones that lived in the city and the ones that lived around the area, they had no reason to come and do those things. And the world took notice because those changes affected their economy. And I think this is an important part. If we want to say we want to have an impact on the culture around us, then we need to change our spending habits. And I think the key to this is that we spend with conviction, not for convenience. You know, sometimes we just buy from this place or that place because it's the easier thing to do. But we don't spend out of a sense of conviction. Christians in the city, they no longer went to the temple. They spent their money based on the convictions that they have. And I don't know if you've thought about this, but there were likely some of these believers who were probably part of that temple industry, that tourism industry. They had to make some decisions. Am I going to continue in this line of work? Or am I going to have convictions about what I'm doing and not make a profit off of misleading someone into this type of thing? You know, in our day and age, I think a lot of Christians don't spend our money out of a sense of conviction. We see in our world today a number of places where culture has changed. And Christians, believers all across our country have seen less and less a problem with those changes. You know, one of those areas is gambling, the lottery, sports betting. You know, all of that's on the rise. As of 2016, only 36% of Christians thought sports betting was morally wrong. That's only about a third. That's even less today. And the gambling industry is continuing to rise in this country, and it's projected to rise by 25% over the next 5 years. You know, Christians don't have the same convictions about gambling and the lottery and things like that as we used to. Another area is alcohol. You know, it used to be you didn't get alcohol in the grocery stores. You didn't get alcohol at the convenience store. You had to go to a special place to get the alcohol, right? We used to only have that, and only a very few restaurants served it. You and I grew up, we wouldn't go to restaurants that served alcohol. Today, you're hard-pressed to find a restaurant that doesn't serve it. You know, that's the changing status of our culture today. We don't spend with conviction, and therefore we aren't changing culture. What about not just our money, but what about how we spend our time? Do you know that Sunday used to be a day that was reserved for church? Used to be a day that there wasn't anything else on the schedule, certainly not in the local community, right? There wouldn't be sporting events, there wouldn't be practices, there wouldn't be those types of things going on a Sunday. And if they did, eventually they snuck in, we'll just do them Sunday afternoons, right? Well, today what do we find? They're scheduled 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, right over the church service times. Because why? Christians aren't saying no. Christians aren't saying, I won't do this. And as a result, they keep moving in. The culture continues to creep in during us. Our change in spending our time and our money should create a stir in the culture around us. We shouldn't just allow us to be floating along with what the culture tells us. And this is what was happening there in Ephesus. Let's look at verse 26. We see, secondly, that living for Christ challenges their beliefs. Verse 26, it says, Moreover, ye see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all of Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods which are made with hands. So, of course, the temple was filled with statues of Artemis, statues of Diana. They were making little shrines to Diana. All of these workmen, craftsmen, were building their own gods for people to come and worship. And Paul's message, and it wasn't just Paul's, it was the Bible's message, was such that says there is only one God. And He is not a God made with hands. He is not one to come to the temple and worship. He is not going to be your God of hunting and fertility. He is not going to be anything like what you have had in the past or have known in the past, because He's the creator of all things. He's the sustainer of all things. He's the sovereign God of the universe. He alone is worthy of worship. He alone is worthy of praise. And as a result, you need to put aside these other gods. And you know what? The people were understanding that all of a sudden their beliefs were being challenged. And that's the first point about this, that biblical norms often run counter to the culture's narrative. The culture wants to tell us all kinds of things that we should believe in. That was true in Paul's day, and it's true our day today. It wants to set our values and our ideals and what it is we should set up as gods in our life. No, we don't have the temples like we used to, but do you know what? There's still plenty of temples around where people are worshiping their own gods. They're setting up their own ideals in various ways. These silversmiths and people here in this industry, they were concerned primarily about making money. And of course, money was built on a value system that was promoted in their culture. But this was also a religious system that was being tackled. And the biblical narrative ran completely an opposite direction from what the culture was saying. You know, that's true even today. We've unfortunately, and I don't know how you can answer all these questions, but we've given up a lot of things in terms of the narrative of the culture, what we've allowed them to change what we can use. Do you know it used to be that the rainbow had a certain symbolism? The rainbow came right from the Bible, right? But you know what? The culture's claimed it for their own. The culture has taken the rainbow. The rainbow is supposed to be a reminder of God's judgment on the sin of this world. A reminder that He has the power to bring about worldwide condemnation. That He is going to give us a promise that the earth will never be flooded again. That's what the Bible tells us in Genesis. And what does the culture tell us? It's a symbol of pride in the immorality that God calls an abomination. What do we do with that? That symbol that the culture has chosen to claim is not a symbol that God has chosen to give up. It's still a symbol forever of God's truth to us. We must not just concede to let these things go. We need to continue to proclaim biblical truth. We need to challenge the beliefs of the culture, and only then will we find ourselves having a dent in it. We need to continue to proclaim the biblical truth that gender is a God-given trait that is not changed based on your personal preference. We need to not give up those truths. We need to make sure the Bible's truth, we don't have to preach it in an angry way. We don't have to try to create problems. We're going to see that in a moment. But we cannot give up ground in terms of truth. The Bible is clear about some areas. And the biblical norms will run counter to the culture's narrative. We are here to challenge their beliefs. If we don't challenge their beliefs, why would they need to change? If we're okay with what they believe, then what does the Bible offer? It's just another thing. It's just a religious crutch. It's just you want to do good, feel good about yourself, you go to church and do your thing. You know what? That's honestly what most of the world feels about the church. And it's because we haven't presented truth in a way that challenges their beliefs. We see in verse 27 and 28, he says, not only is our craft in danger to be set at nothing, but also that the temple of the great goddess of Diana should be despised. Her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshipeth. And when they heard these things, they were full of wrath, and they cried out, saying, great is Diana of the Ephesians. And this is the other thing that I think comes out of challenging the culture's beliefs. And that is this: belief in one true God, it inherently condemns the false idols that our culture presents. You can't have belief in one true God without, just by nature, condemning the false idols, the false gods that the culture is presenting to you. Because think about this: when you turn on a light in a dark room, do you have to go around and say, I've got to shoo out this darkness? No. Instantly, it's gone. Right? Light inherently vacates the darkness. You don't have to go around with a broom and try to get that darkness from the corners. When the light illuminates, the darkness is gone. Isn't that what we're called to be? Light in the culture around us? We don't have to go around shooing the darkness from the corners. We just have to shine the light. We just have to present God's truth. And that light will inherently take that darkness away from it. And you know what? These men saw it in Ephesus. They saw their ideals. They saw their culture. It was all being threatened. They were worried what would be destroyed. And you know, the problem is, in our society today as believers, oftentimes we think we can worship God but still leave a place for culture in our life. Still leave a place for those other gods. Still just give them their own little dark corner to live in. And we can have our own little place where we worship God. And you know, what does Jesus himself say about that? Matthew 6:24, Jesus said, no man can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other, because you cannot serve God and mammon. It's talking about serving the things of the world or serving God. We have to make a choice. And so, as you draw closer to Christ, you should find yourself drawing away from those things of the world. Because what is the new normal as believers, as Christians? It should be very abnormal to the experiences of the world around us. That should be what's normal for us. Serving Christ, living for Him, doing those things that have eternity in view, instead of allowing ourselves to continue in those same experiences that we were living for before. Because to have one true God in your life means that you will not have room for any other. Let's look at our third point, and that is this: we must choose our battles wisely. We must choose our battles wisely. And the rest of the passage here talks about some of the challenges that were being dealt with here. It says in verse 29, the whole city was filled with confusion. Having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed in one accord to the theater. And when Paul would have entered in unto the people, the disciples suffered him not. Certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring him that he would not venture himself into the theater. And so we see here a city that is in an uproar. This idea of confusion, really, it's not about, we don't know what to do. It was the idea of an uproar. It was a mass hysteria event. They were filled with this confusion. We don't even know what it's all about, but we're all getting sucked up into it. They're all worked up into this fervor. And not everyone even knew what the uproar was all about. It was a confused and chaotic scene of people who were coming together and making a big commotion, but they weren't even all clear on their objective. We saw this here in verse 32. It says, some therefore cried one thing, and some therefore cried another, for the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. In other words, he's saying, most of the people that were in this group, they didn't even know why they were there. They just got caught up in the moment. They were hollering and shouting, and everybody was this and that. And it says most of them didn't even know what they were doing there. They were just joining in with the crowd. And sometimes we've seen that type of chaos in culture around us. Sometimes culture is so confused and in a worked uproar and kind of in this frenzy, if you will. And sometimes the people that are involved, they don't even know what they're doing there. This is still true today. And the truth is that this is our first point. Sometimes our culture cannot see clearly through the chaos. There's so much chaos. There's so many different people there inciting riots and inciting these types of events that sometimes the people aren't seeing clearly through them. This is exactly what happened here. Verse 33 and 34, all this group gets together. It says they drew Alexander out of the multitude, and the Jews putting him forward. Alexander beckoned with the hand. He was about to try to present some reason to the people. And he says he would have made his defense unto the people. It says, but when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice, the space of 2 hours, they cried out, great is Diana of the Ephesians. Now, you've probably seen on the news different times, for whatever reason, people chanting and people saying, these types of things in marches for this or that. But you know what they do? They wait till the camera comes and then they work themselves up for the chant. And then once the camera moves on, they're done. These people had no cameras in front of them. And for 2 solid hours, they were worked up into such a frenzy that all they could yell was, great is Diana of the Ephesians. These people were out of their mind. This was craziness. For 2 hours they were doing this. And most of them didn't even know what they were doing there. This is what the Bible tells us. They were in this frenzy. When someone is in a state like that, are they able to be reasoned with? No. Alexander was about to try to present his defense of the gospel, his defense of Christianity, maybe to present the gospel to this group, and they just drowned him out with this crazy chanting. He needed the wisdom at that point in time to say, these people need to calm down first. I'm not going to be able to reason with them. There's too much chaos. There's too much problems going on. I'm not going to be heard. And sometimes culture is not going to be able to hear our message because of their own chaos. Well, we see eventually someone does bring the voice of reason. The town clerk comes, verse 35, and he says, ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how that the city of the Ephesians is a worshiper of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Jupiter? Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For ye have brought hither these men which are neither robbers of churches, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. Some interesting things about this statement that I think we need to unpack. And it all kind of works out this way, that God confirms his own truth over time. We can still recognize God works things out over time. Interesting what this town clerk has to say. Again, these people just get themselves off 2 hours of frenzied chanting. And he says, we are the Ephesians. We are worshiping this great goddess. And he says, these things cannot be spoken against. In other words, he's saying to the people, we know, without a doubt, with full assurance, that just as sure as the temple of Diana has stood for 700 years, that it will never be destroyed. It will endure forever. Because she is our goddess. She is the one that we worship. He believed wholeheartedly that this was never going to go by the wayside. And he said, as a result, we shouldn't be upset by some religious radicals, Christians, who claim to follow this resurrected Jewish carpenter from Nazareth. This is what the town clerk uses to calm down the people. He says, we know that their God's not true. We know that our God's true. And so we shouldn't worry about these people because they're nothing. And this is the first claim. Then he buttresses this with this argument. He says, we say that our goddess came from Zeus himself, or Jupiter. He says, we worship the great goddess Diana and the image which fell down from Jupiter. Now, this isn't the planet Jupiter like we have today. Jupiter was the Roman name for the Greek head of the gods. We know Zeus as the Greek god, and Jupiter was the name of the Roman god who was the head of all of their gods. And they believed that the proof that this temple of Diana was going to endure forever was because, he says, that the image fell down from Jupiter. Now, scholars debate about this, but this was possibly a meteorite that had fallen down, and they had found in Ephesus, and it confirmed that the temple was there. They were worshiping Diana, and they took this as a sign that this was Zeus himself condoning that the Diana that they were worshiping was true and authentic. And so this piece of meteorite was likely enshrined in the temple along with the worship of Diana. It was the authenticator of what they were doing. This is what he's saying. And so he's saying, this is a sure thing. But interestingly, this is what he says. He says, this is what he says about the Christians. He says, they brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches. Now, he's not talking about our churches, the type of Christian churches full of believers. He's talking about his temples, the temples of the pagan gods. He says, they haven't stolen anything from the temples that we worship. And he said, they haven't blasphemed our gods. This is interesting. You're saying that this man in town has no evidence that these believers desecrated the temples to the pagan gods, and they didn't actively blaspheme or say things against Diana of the Ephesians. This is what the town clerk reveals. I think this is the point. They apparently, the Christians, did not actively teach against a particular pagan god. Apparently, there was some wisdom here that said, we can't begin to teach this way because look at what uproar we might have if we do. But yet, what were they teaching? They were teaching truth in Christ alone, in one God alone, and because the light was shining clearly from the truth that they were presenting, it was obvious what they were preaching against. They didn't have to say what they were against. They just had to say what they were for. I think there's a problem sometimes with us as believers, Christians in the world. We're so busy saying the things that we're against. Well, I'm against this, and our cultures, I'll tell you what's wrong with politics. I'll tell you what's wrong with, everything else. And, we like to get angry and mad at everything around us instead of maybe we just need to say what's right. What are we for? You know what? The culture's doing what the culture does because it doesn't know Christ. That's what the culture's expected to do, right? The culture's not expected to know the Lord. The culture's not expected to read their Bible. The culture's not expected to understand that Christ died for their sins and they can be transformed by having saving faith that they put in Him. They don't understand any of that. They're going along with what they know and what they have, and that is simply an old sin nature, the old flesh that every one of us had once before we were Christians and continues to struggle with and will continue to struggle with until the day we die. That's what the world has. So why sit around and tell the world all the things that are wrong with their flesh? We need to tell them how to get that flesh changed, how to be born again. That's what the Bible's truth is there to present. The more we shed light, the more we tell them what we are for, the more we proclaim God's truth, the more they recognize we're not for the things that they're for. The more they realize their darkness is exposed. They understood here in Ephesus that the darkness was exposed, but they didn't even have to say things directly against this. Now here's the irony of all this. God confirms His truth over time, right? As we shed the light, as we share this with people, we tell people what we're for. Obviously, number one, people were coming to the faith. This was the result. We know this from Ephesus, right? People were coming to the faith. Many, many people, not just in Ephesus, but all over Asia. As a result, people weren't spending the same money, and therefore the economy had been affected. So Christians had an impact there. And all of this was being done without having an active smear campaign against the pagan gods. How does God do that? That's His power. That's how He works. God works when we present His truth. And this is what was happening. The interesting thing, though, all of the claims that he just made, these things cannot be spoken against, and Diana is going to last forever. Do you know where Ephesus, the temple of Artemis, is today? Gone. Long gone. Within 200 years of this event happening in history, that temple would have been destroyed completely. Completely gone. By the 5th century, Christianity would become the official religion of the Roman world. And the temple of Diana, according to historical records, was systematically dismantled and then used for other building projects across the kingdom. Diana, the great one who fell from Jupiter, the one that all Ephesus worships, the one that is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, gone. Not just gone because people got disinterested, gone because people were changed for Christ. That's the difference. This is what happened. It would be the influence of Christianity that would cause the doom of this pagan idolatry in their culture. Do you know why, of course, there's still a resurgence today in Greek and Roman gods, but when we look at them today, and you see films about them, or you see books written about them, there's interest in them, but I don't know anybody that seriously worships any of these guys. We look at them as fairy tales and fictions and legends and things like that because we see them for what they are. What caused a whole culture over the last 2,000 years to move from we worship these gods to we make fun of these gods? Christianity. Christianity changed that. It exposed all of the false gods of the pantheon for who they really were. Nothing but false idols of a culture that's long gone. But Christianity has endured because God's truth is eternal, because there is only one true God, because He is the sovereign. And, you know, we have to recognize if we use the waiting game sometimes, we're still going to win. The waiting game always wins because God is faithful and God will have a return on the investment of truth that we make in culture. Now, here's the point. We don't want to just say, don't get the wrong idea, that we can just sit on the sidelines for every battle of culture. That's not true. Sometimes we are called to go in and fight hand to hand with what the culture is presenting us. But we do need wisdom about when to enter that debate. We need wisdom. Sometimes the world is in such chaos and confusion that they will not be capable of hearing the truth. They're going to be worked up into a frenzy, and you're going to have to say, okay, I'm going to let things cool off here before we can trot in and do our thing. And sometimes we may just need to allow God to prove His own truth over time. The point is this. Christianity is designed to change the culture. When Christians begin to live as true living believers, like the Bible tells us to, and present God's truth faithfully, not just in our lives, but in what we speak to others, as we begin to spend our money with conviction, and instead of just allowing the culture to move in on us and influence how we think and how we do things, do you know what? The culture will take notice. And Christianity will continue to have a transforming force on the culture around us. We haven't seen this in quite a long time. But I want to take you back to remind you as we close of a story that goes back to the year 1904. 1904, the place was Wales, small southwestern corner of England, known for its hard-working, blue-collar people. Many of them worked in mines. There were several ministers there in very small churches, smaller than ours. And they just were burdened that the Lord would do a work in them and through their people. And they began to pray, and they began to get together, and they began to ask the Lord to do something here in their little community of Wales. And they began to hold church meetings and revival meetings and very long meetings oftentimes to seek the Lord's empowerment, to seek the Lord's presence. There were no advertisements. There were no posters. There were no big tent meetings. These were just small town pastors doing what they could in their own little churches. But over the course of less than a year, the Lord began to move in Wales. And then eventually the rest of the United Kingdom, and eventually captured tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of souls for the kingdom. It was known as the Great Welsh Revival. Throngs of people began to flock to church meetings from England and even from America. And they began to experience firsthand that God was there and God was working in their hearts. Now, if you had lived in that time and place and you'd said, I've heard about this Welsh revival, and you said, I'm going to go over and see, you would have been hard-pressed to be a part. You know why? Because most visitors that came were turned away. There wasn't enough room in the churches. People that did come to the churches, they stood in the back. There weren't enough seats for them. Many of them were turned away to guest houses or other places where they just couldn't accept them. People came. People, hungry to receive from the Lord. And it wouldn't be long when you came to one of these meetings where you would hear pockets of saints that began to lift their voices in song, and the sounds of their voices would go around the room, and people would continue to praise, and the songs would continue. Welsh Revival was known for its singing. Much song was a part of this revival. But then you would see one stand up and they would seek prayer for someone who was unsaved, a loved one. Another one would then stand up and testify how God did something in his life in such a way that it transformed him. And such was that account. Time and time again, all over the country, there were testimonies of hardened souls receiving salvation, lives being changed, were the talk of the town. The impact of the Lord's hand was noticed in the lives of everyone. In the space of just 4 months after the revival began, there were an estimated 200,000 people brought to a saving relationship with Christ. In 4 months, from tiny little churches. And there were stories all over town, stories all over the region. Profanity disappeared. Theaters were deserted. And the courts were abandoned because there wasn't any crime. Bars began to shut down. Nobody was coming. Entertainment, such as football matches, they could not compete with the presence of the Lord. Sales of beer and alcohol declined steeply, while pocket testaments were snapped up like hot cross buns as people hungered for the bread of life. The story was told as the mine workers went back to their mines. The horses in the mines, they became confused and unresponsive and disobedient to the mine workers. Why? Because these men who had come back changed, no longer used obscenity and violence, and kicking and beating their horses to make them do their work. The horses didn't understand their commands anymore. There was no more four-letter words being used. Public houses, pubs, they became almost empty. Men and women who used to waste their money getting drunk were now saving it and giving it to the church. They were using their money to buy clothes and food for families in need. Stealing and other offenses became less and less. Oftentimes, a magistrate would come to the court and find that there were simply no cases to try. Can you imagine? People who had been careless about paying their bills or paying back money that they had borrowed, they gave back what they owed. People who had quarreled and had great disagreements with others, they began to forgive each other and they were reconciled. Society was changed. And Wales, at least for a time, became a God-fearing nation. All because some Christians were changed. All because lives began to reflect the truth of God's Word, began to live it out. And that light made the darkness go away. That's what can happen. And we say, oh, that can't happen. It's different age, different time. You know, that's what they said in 1904. That's what they said in the Great Awakening. That's what they said in every great revival that's ever happened in the course of mankind. Oh, it can't happen now. It's dark times. You know what? God's always capable of making those kinds of things happen. But we have to look for that revival to start in us. And just like Paul, just like in Ephesus, maybe we can make such a stir that we change the culture around us. Let's pray that we do.